Welcome to What Matters Now, and this will be another informal conversation with Haviv Rettig Gur and myself, Amanda Borschel-Dan. Haviv, thank you so much for joining me in my home today.
Amanda, thank you so much for having me over. And listeners, you might be hearing the jet lag. We're going to power through this, right?
Jet lag this week, 7 a.m. recording last week. It's always something, right?
It's
Haviv?
important to have excuses at the ready. Always.
All right. So I'm ready for any excuse you can throw at me. And since you were touring campuses in the past several weeks, giving some speaking tours on North American campuses, I was thinking that this week, why don't we discuss anti-Semitism on campus? And just to begin with, I'd like to bring some figures from Australia, actually. In Australia, 64% of Jewish university students said that they had experienced anti-Semitism during their studies. And according to the survey, more than half of them regularly concealed their Jewish identity. You know what's significant about this survey, though, Haviv? When it was actually done. When do you think this was done? During the war or before?
I'm guessing before, because that would make it interesting.
That's right. This was released in August of 2023. And so already in August of 2023 in Australia, 64% of Jewish university students said they had experienced anti-Semitism. Of course, since the war, there have been many other surveys. And just to give one particular result, in a survey that actually measured before the war and after the war, 73% of Jewish college students in North America who were surveyed said that they have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism since the beginning of this school year, the 2023-2024 school year alone. So you were just on campuses. Does this make sense to you with what you saw yourself?
I think it does. It does absolutely. I went on a speaking tour of quite a few campuses. GW, that's in Washington, George Washington University, Brown, Harvard, Columbia. The students I met there were incredibly nervous, incredibly anxious. And they're nervous and anxious about other students. And I gave a talk on the Harvard campus. And I got protesters, which I thought was absolutely delightful. Now I have pictures of myself facing protesters, which you got to come back from a campus tour with those. Otherwise, you're not important enough to merit even a protest, right?
You know you've made it when.
That's the thing. But what was really frustrating, and I'm being flippant about it quite intentionally, because I have very, very little respect for the protest. The protest came right at the beginning, and it was over the top. It was kids, talking about just genocide, and kids talking, one student with a perfect American accent who is a student at Harvard Law School, talking about herself as a refugee, a Gazan refugee, which again is this sort of UNRWA definition of refugee that allows you to be a refugee for all time with other citizenships, etc. So it really was a caricature of itself. It was everything that Israelis say that these protesters are. But what was frustrating to me, I felt it was a psychological win, because as these protesters got up from the crowd in the hall and started walking out with big banners and very disruptively, I sort of said into the microphone, "Everybody, I'm sorry, we're being treated to a moment of theater. We'll just take a break and let them do their theater." And they felt very insulted by me saying that, because this is an American college campus, and being insulted is a major part of the experience. But I watched the kids. The other kids, the rest of the audience, which was mostly Jewish. And they didn't take it as a joke. They didn't think it was funny. They didn't think they were getting on a plane back to Israel and never had to think about these protesters ever again. And it really drove home for me something that I kind of had been thinking in the back of my mind, but the more I've been meeting young American Jews, and Australian Jews. I was in Australia last month, and the more I've been meeting these young people, I met with student leaders in Sydney, the more I've realized that these protesters aren't about us. They're not about Israel, and they're not targeting Israelis. Israelis are not the audience. Israelis speak Hebrew off on the other side of the world. They're not hearing, they're not seeing. I mean, you and I, as English speakers who are literally paid to follow these questions, notice these college protests. Israelis don't notice these college protests. So who is the audience? Are these college protesters just talking to themselves? Maybe they're their own audience. Maybe it's all virtue signaling. But to me, in that room, I really saw viscerally that the Jewish kids are the audience. And this is a kind of abusive targeting of the Jews on campus. And it's the argument that there's one way to be a Jew. And if you're not that good Jew, then you're an evil Jew. And we will abuse you, and we will ostracize you, and we will make it impossible for you to think straight, and make it impossible for you to focus in class or in the library or on college campus, certainly to identify as you identify. So it was it was sobering. It was anyway, we could talk about it, but it was sobering. It was frustrating. I felt a kind of anger at these protesters for the first time ever. For the first time ever, I didn't feel just pity for them, because I understood that they are actually abusing somebody. It's just not Israel or Israelis.
It's really interesting what you're saying. We're going to refer to a couple data sets. And starting in August 2023, the ADL Center for Anti-Semitism Research, in partnership with Hillel International, and it was facilitated by College Pulse, fielded a nationally representative survey of over 3,000 American college students, of which 527 were Jewish, from 689 campuses nationwide. So one of the things that we're going to discuss is the differences between this particular survey and a survey that came before the war. And I referred to already that 73% of Jewish college students surveyed have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism. But one of the other things that stuck out to me is that since October 7th, students who have felt comfortable with others knowing they're Jewish decreased significantly. So now, whereas before 63.7% of Jewish students felt fine knowing that other people knew that they're Jewish, today 38.6% feel the same. This is a huge drop. That it says to me that these kids on campuses are no longer wearing their Stars of David, perhaps even taking off their kippot. They're hiding that they're Jewish at this point. And that is just shocking to me in this era.
The fact that only 63% were comfortable before tells you that a lot of the groundwork was already being laid, and a lot of students already felt it and smelled it in the air, in the zeitgeist. And then it actually came and exploded on them, and that dropped the 63 to 38. Absolutely. I'm a Zionist. Don't tell anybody. One of the, not silver linings, but genuinely positive and profound and good outcomes of this terrible time on these campuses, of this experience that these Jewish kids are going through of abuse, is exactly the opposite of what the bad guys are trying to accomplish. Across the board in these surveys, we're seeing Jewish college students saying they are experiencing more anti-Semitism. They are more worried and anxious about showing their Jewishness, not just their pro-Israel feelings. Some of them don't support Israel. Some of them don't care one way or another about Israel. They are also having trouble expressing their Jewishness on campuses. But that is also causing an enormous rallying around the flag. Not necessarily the Israeli flag, certainly the Jewish flag, also the Israeli flag. It's causing a rise in identification. There are one analysis of the data by a sociologist at Tufts, Eitan Hirsch, who he posted to Twitter, and he wrote 3 essays about, and I urge people to go read it. But I'm just going to run through in a single sentence form 7 reactions that the data bears out by Jewish students. Reaction number 1, a heightened sense of Jewish identity. For example, the question was, one question asked by students was, how close do you feel to a Jewish community right now? 17% of Jewish college students said very close before the war. 35% say very close now. Reaction number 2, participation in Jewish life is high, but it is fraught with the anxiety, with the concerns. They're showing up at Jewish life on campus when they weren't before. Students are forming opinions about Israel. Jewish students are forming opinions about Israel they did not have before, good or bad, and have increased their support. In other words, they are experiencing these protests against Israel, not just as over the top, but as attacks on them that, if anything, validate the basic idea that they need an Israel in this world, because otherwise they're just utterly vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. Reaction number 4, Jewish students are following the news and drawing on different sources than non-Jewish students. They are more likely to read us, frankly.
Newspapers and not just social media.
Right, exactly. And so they're not just not getting swept up in the same TikTok as non-Jewish students. They're actively going to look for real sources that they can trust. Reaction 5, Jewish students, and essentially only Jewish students, I'm quoting here, are attending pro-Israel events. Other students have, they might be pro, they might be anti. They're mostly anti, but they are also generally just trying to keep their heads down and stay out of the fight. Jewish students are attending pro-Israel events, and pro-Israel events are essentially almost entirely Jewish. Jewish students and Muslim students both say the war affected their mental health. They feel the anxiety. Okay, that's okay. It's okay to feel anxiety. It's okay in a time of great need and a real war with tremendous civilian cost. It's okay to also feel anxiety. They say so more than other students, non-Jewish students, non-Muslim students. And finally, reaction 7, 4 in 10 Jewish students say they personally are targeted with anti-Semitic messages on American college campuses. I did not know if my experience of meeting these tremendously anxious, worried students on college campuses, students who are more scared than the Israelis, who have family in the war, or, I have no way to compare to Gazans. I'm not in Gaza. I don't know Gazans. But certainly, I leave in Israel in wartime. I go to an American college campus and I meet scared people for the first time. That was a surprise to me. But what was interesting about it was that their responses, this incredible rallying around their identity, the overblown, just astonishingly loud and violent and emotionally violent and mentally violent, just response on these campuses has sent Jewish students back to the source. I'll put it even a different way. A lot of Zionists are being made on American college campuses right now. That's probably not the intention of the protesters.
So it's always interesting to me when we read the same things, how you pick out one thing and I pick out something else. And one of the other points made by Eitan Hersh in his 3-part essay analyzing this data that was collected before and after the war is that Jewish students overwhelmingly perceive a social penalty for supporting the right of Israel to exist. And how does this play out? Particularly on the far left and among specific identity groups such as Muslims, LGBT, non-white students, a large share of students say they don't want to be friends with anyone who supports the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. This isn't a fringe position on campus. This is the majority position on campus, potentially, because, campuses tend to run more to the left and Jews are definitely the minority. And so about a third of non-Jewish students do not want to be friends with students who support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. That is mind-blowing.
It's the only thing taught on campus. It's the only thing taught on these campuses. It is elite academic opinion now. And it is not serious. It is intellectually not serious. But it feels moral. It feels like a moral crusade. The Israeli view of this is very simple. And it's astonishing how people can actually live in such different mental worlds. But if you're an Israeli Jew and you look around at the world, you see an Eastern Hemisphere that is emptied of Jews. The story of the 20th century is essentially that you either learned English, learned Hebrew, or died. That's the Jewish story of the 20th century. Apologies to French Jews, who are the great exception, but they're not really the exception, because after the Holocaust, France is refilled by North African Jews who have to flee to the last man, woman, and child. And so it is the exception that proves the rule that you had to learn English, learn Hebrew, or die. And French Jews are leaving at an unprecedented level right now because of uptick in just literal terrorism against them from some sections of the Muslim, very large Muslim minority in France. And so that's the story of the Jews of the 20th century. And when you're an Israeli and you look at this world and you look at a Jew-free, essentially Jew-free Eastern Hemisphere, statistically Jew-free Eastern Hemisphere, with apologies, I guess, to Britain, where really it is a different story, but everywhere else is not a different story. To the Israeli, there are really three kinds of people. There are ignoramuses, people who don't know the story. They don't know that the last living Jew is the Zionist Jew. And so they think that there was some other option for the Jews. And if you think there was some other option, you can start telling the Jews what you 75, 80, 90, 100 years later think their great-great-great-grandparents should have done. That's adorable. It's ignorant, but it's adorable. There are genocidal people who really just wish the Jews were all dead and then all our problems would be solved. This is a very common view in places like Algeria today. And then there's Zionists. That's it. Those are the three options. There is no, because the Jews historically had no other option but Israel. The Jews who ended up in Israel only after all the doors closed to them to the West, to America and Canada and Britain and France and Brazil and Australia and all the different countries that shut immigration to the Jews in the 1920s and 30s. And the Jews, as they're fleeing an increasingly disastrous position in Europe, have literally nowhere to go. The last Jews are huge numbers of anti-Zionist Jews are forced to come to Israel and become Israelis, including from the Arab world, where the Arab world ends the 1960s more Judenrein than post-Holocaust Ukraine. With respect to the Arab belief that you can be an anti-Zionist, the Arab world left the Jews no choice but Zionism. And so to an Israeli looking around at these, this new fad of moralizing about Israel's existence, it's a privileged, safe, Western moral debate about whether millions of Jews should or should not have been allowed to survive. And only ignorance prevents the people taking part in it from understanding that. And again, on campus, it's driving Jews into Zionism's arms. This, by the way, is the great hack of Zionism. Zionism hacked history. And it goes something like this. Listeners, this is just for us Zionists. Please don't tell the rest of the world or they'll understand us and be able to defeat us. I'm joking, of course. If they love us, okay, this is Zionism's hack. Great. Wonderful. Everything's fine. And if they hate us, you guys with me? We just turned Zionist. That was it. There are no more catastrophic endings to this story because there is Zionism and there is Israel. So those students on those campuses, and this is basically what my message was, and we talked for a lot of time and they wanted to know about the war, but my basic message to them was just that. There is no catastrophic end to, it's silly to talk to American Jews about a catastrophic end to American Jewry. American Jewish history is the opposite trajectory in every way at every turn. But French Jews don't think it's ridiculous to talk that way anymore. So I just want to clarify to them, there is no catastrophic end, even if America becomes what these idiot protesters want it to become, which it won't. I am extremely optimistic about America. But even if it does, it still won't. Jews have where to go. And because they have where to go, there's no need to fear. They can stand up and they can fight. They can fight. They become better Americans because they become citizens willing to take on, not to fight for Jews. Jews have been safe in America for a century because of America's own character. They need to fight for that character. Make sure that America is an America that doesn't turn on communities for being community, that doesn't take histories they don't understand and decide to moralize their way into wishing millions of people had died. That America. Jews can stand up and fight because there are no more catastrophic endings. That is Zionism's gift. These Jews are not making Aliyah, these college students, but they know that history isn't going to end badly for them because of Zionism. And these protesters, God bless them, I hope they're a Mossad operation because they're the most successful Mossad operation in the history of the Mossad, are turning huge hundreds of thousands of American Jewish college students Zionist.
I want to quote from an essay that Franklin Foer wrote for The Atlantic with the great title, "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." And he speaks, among other things, about what's happening on campuses. And he says, Among the primary targets of the activists were the Hillel centers present on most college campuses. These centers occasionally coordinate trips to Israel and, on some campuses, sponsor student groups supportive of Israel. Those facts led pro-Palestinian activists to describe Hillel as an arm of the, quote, Israeli war machine. What made it so worrying is that Hillel's practical purpose is not to defend Israel, but to provide Shabbat dinners and a space for a ritual and prayer. To condemn Hillel is to condemn Jewish religious life on campus.
Also, I should say, the alternative to Hillel on campus is Chabad. Hillels in most campuses don't want to be the Israel center on campus. They want to be the Jewish Life Center on campus. I've talked to Hillel directors. I was at a huge Israel summit of Hillels. Hillels have been turning into Israel centers because of the protests. And they weren't. And Hillel is an organization led by truly progressive American Jews. And the alternative is Chabad, led by religiously very conservative and politically very conservative rabbis on all these college campuses.
With audacious hospitality.
With very wonderful, I mean, their whole job, both of these groups, is hospitality. But the point is that if you first of all, Hillels have responded the way Jewish college students have responded. They're having big Israel summits. 1,000 college students met in Atlanta to talk about the kind of abuse they're facing on campus, to rally together, to fight back all together. That was a beautiful thing to see and a beautiful thing to be part of. And Hillels are not turning more Zionist. This is a Zionist organization, but they are turning more focused on Israel than they were in the past, because that is the front line for the abuse of Jewish students on campus. And if you do manage to make it uncomfortable for a kid to go to Hillel, maybe Chabad can pick them up, and then they're more right-wing Zionists. So the point is, we've hacked the system. Let them rage. Let them rail against us. Let them scream. Let them shout. Let them posture. Let them virtue signal for themselves. Let them virtue signal, because if they use the word Israel, then they're not abusing Jews, while they are actually abusing Jews. If the Arab world, a lot of this, there's also a piece in Tablet magazine just this week, huge increase in foreign money and a huge increase in foreign students on campus. And a lot of this activism is foreign. A lot of the masses that are turning out for the protests, a lot of the ability of these protests to become campus wide and things that the administration is unable to stop, even if it wishes it would go away, is a lot of these foreign students, especially from the Muslim world. The Arab world and the Muslim world, how shall I put this, have done more good for Zionism than any single European country that kicked out its Jews or even murdered its Jews. Because every last Jew was made to flee the Arab world. Every single one. In 1930 in Baghdad, something like a quarter of Baghdad's population is Jewish. And by 1952, none of Baghdad's population is Jewish. I want listeners to try to imagine New York City, not today's New York City, which is maybe 10% Jewish, 12% Jewish. New York City back when it was 20% Jewish, 25% Jewish. I want you to imagine that New York City, but in 20 years, every single Jew is gone. Hasidic and secular, non-binary, conservative, Obama voter and Biden voter and Bernie Sanders voter and Trump voter and whoever's to the right of Trump voter, every single kind of Jew, religiously, politically, Iraqi Jews included, anti-Zionist Iraqi nationalists, all of whom fled. So the idea that, this is an old thing, what's happening on these campuses. And it's the same stupidity of the same anti-Semitism encountering the same Zionism and not understanding how Zionism is winning, even as they feel in their great moral crusade against the Jewish evil in the world that they somehow are going to win this. I'm not going to say I'm comfortable with what's happening on campus. Quite the opposite. Watching Jews be abused is painful, but I'm I'm comfortable to see that the basic logic of Zionism still functions and still works and still protects. And that's happening way over there in distant places over on college campuses to college kids who never had to think about Zionism, don't care about Zionism, don't feel Zionist. It's there for them when they need it. That's a wonderful strengthening thing to see on these tours of these college campuses.
I think it's no secret that I'm also a Zionist. We discussed last week how I had my awakening at Mount Herzl. I think there's no more naive Zionist story than that. But don't you think at the same time, Haviv, that these students are becoming more ostracized, even as they're becoming more insular? Let me give you just another figure from one of the surveys that Black students are far more likely than white students to say they wouldn't be friends with someone who supports the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. That's 43% agree versus 16%. 43% of Black students would not want to be friends with somebody who supports the state of Israel. But they're also far more likely to say that they avoid socializing with Jews. 14% say they avoid socializing with Jews versus 2% of whites who at least admit they avoid it. So I think it's a little sticky here when you have a feeling that Zionism is winning. That's great. Zionism is winning. But the Jewish students don't necessarily have where to turn. And actually, about half an hour before you came over, Haviv, I was sent some information by Esha Torah. You mentioned Chabad. Esha Torah is perhaps even farther in the acceptance of any kind of Jew who wants to wander in movement to make them into more practicing Jews. I don't know, that's arguable. But what they wrote me to say is that in the wake of October 7th, tens of thousands of unaffiliated Jews worldwide have reached out to Aish, seeking meaning and inspiration after suffering anti-Semitic attacks for the first time. And I just find it a little puzzling that the Hillel wouldn't be the one to pick up the gauntlet here. We talked about how they are focusing more on Zionism. But if these students are just going online and communicating with the rabbi chatbot that Esha Torah has, it makes me a little worried for the future of the American Jewish people.
Well, first of all, I really want to talk to a rabbi chatbot now. I mean, you answered the question when you asked it, right? Because the question is, these kids are feeling this ostracizing, this marginalization. And just Aish says tens of thousands have turned to them. Hillels have seen. People have turned to Hillels. They're not choosing Aish instead. They're all kinds of different kids are going to all kinds of different places. I don't know what exactly the Google search is, but I'm sure that Aish and Chabad and Hillel all have bought some various, ads on Google searches. And that's the story. The story is, they're being marginalized. There's a tragedy here. There's a tragedy here, especially with Black students. And the reason there's a tragedy with Black students is that the American Jews have always been at the forefront of the civil rights movement. I mean, at the forefront. I mean, the one white kid killed with the Freedom Riders in the 50s when they were lynched in the South was a Jewish kid. And the white people in the room at the founding of the NAACP were named Moskowitz. And a lot of the white people marching with King right at the front of the march were Jews and rabbis even. And the 64 Civil Rights Bill, the Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement helped draft it in Washington. And when Obama was first elected in 2008, he got, I'm going to get this number wrong. So please go to, it's probably on Wikipedia. I mean, don't work hard. Go find the numbers. But my memory says that 87% of the Black vote went to Obama, and 84% of the Jewish vote. Jews voted Obama almost exactly as much as Blacks, and the next minority in line was like down in the 60s that voted. The most Democratic minority in third place was down in the 60s. Jews in their, not just the ideological elites, which are the first examples I gave, and not just in the 60s, but now and throughout the Jewish community, see the Black experience as a fundamental, I don't know how to put it. When the Jews show up in America, before America closes its doors with the quotas in the early 20s, the Jews discover a brand new experience in Jewish history, and that is the experience of a country that actually tells them, you are part of us. For 1,000 years, Jews lived in what we today would consider, or the 1900 would consider, the Russian Empire. And always they were something else. They were Jewish as opposed to Polish. They were Jewish as opposed to Russian. And then they come to America, and the Americans say to them, hey, you're just Americans. We're all individuals here. This is a Protestant individualistic, radical individualistic kind of society. Welcome. This is Washington's letter in 1790 to the Newport congregation, where he says it's no more that toleration is spoken of as if one class of people can confer it upon another. Washington says to the Jewish community, I refuse to tolerate you. You're just us. There's no tolerance here. I don't give you your rights. You have your rights. Now, there's a lot of hypocrisy, etc., but still, that is the message, and that is the experience of American Jews over a century. And over the course of that century, from the 20s until today, the Jews are profoundly focused on the Black experience, because the Black experience is where this American liberal promise keeps failing. Or in as much as it fails, that's where it fails first and fails worst. And so the Jews are deeply invested in the Black experience, because that's the weather vane of whether America really is the America they need it to be, really is there. This is part of Franklin Foer and John Podhoretz of Commentary just wrote a book about this, or a long essay about this, where they talk about, is that era of American Jew, is that century of America accepting the Jews ending? If that century is ending, that's a pretty dramatic thing. It means America is becoming not this individualistic promise, not this liberal nation that gave Jews, if you just take the Jewish experience of America, that is the greatest compliment ever paid to any country. That the Jews showed up and were just American. There is no other experience in Jewish history that's quite like it. For the Black community to turn on the Jews so profoundly, and there have always been these tensions, and we know a lot about Louis Farrakhan and about deep streams of anti-Semitism in the Black community, and religious anti-Semitism, and sometimes violent anti-Semitism. But right now on these college campuses, using this new sort of far-left ideology to then turn on the Jews, there's one remarkable thing that Eitan Hirsch pulls out of these attitudes. He says, there's anti-Semitism on the far left that focuses on Israel rather than Jews. When you ask questions that say the word Jew, they don't. I think ultimately it's about Jews, but that's me saying it, not the actual respondents. The actual respondents, when you use the word Israel, very negative. When you use the word Jews, they work hard to not say that it's Jews that's the problem. It's a distinction that's very important on the far left. On the far right, especially people who classify themselves as alt-right or Christian conservative, questions, first of all, there's some problems with Jews as Jews. Second of all, there are high rates of those who say that Israeli citizens are legitimate targets by Hamas, which is a pretty tough and shocking thing to say. And on the very, very liberal side, for some reason, the data of this poll found that that's not true, even though I happen to have heard people on the very liberal side say that. So I don't entirely understand all of it, but it might mean that the stuff that makes it onto the news doesn't reflect broader opinion. But then the analysis cuts to minorities. Non-binary people is one minority that they single out with the data, and Black Americans. Black Americans talk about Jews the way the right talks about Jews, and about Israel the way the far left talks about Israel. Black Americans manage to say those 40% who won't have friends who support Israel, they also have views on Jews, statistically according to this data, and they will take both tacks to feel that. Now, I don't know exactly where that comes from. It might come from this narrative of the Jews as oppressors among the other oppressors, and they're oppressed, so they, it's not racism if you don't have power, that kind of thing. But Black Americans on campus, Black students, are worse than either the far right or the far left, according to this data, because they have taken both narratives. And that connects to something that we know about the Black community for generations, which is that their politics can be very left-wing, while their views on social issues can be quite conservative. For example, there's a huge gap between white Americans' support for gay marriage for many, many years and Black Americans' support for gay marriage, even as Black votes were actually very, very left-wing votes. So maybe that's at play here. the point is, Jewish students are on the receiving end of all kinds of prejudice. And I don't think it's going anywhere soon. It has the imprimatur of the elites, of the professors on campus. Universities aren't cracking down on these protests and this abuse. And how shall I put this? That's a terrible thing in history. It's a terrible thing for Jews. It's not a terrible thing for Zionism. That's Zionism's gift, that we have an outlet when the abuse comes.
Haviv, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for joining us on this week's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. If you have any questions or comments about this What Matters Now or any other episode, please drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Thank you, and until next week, Shalom.